I remember the rush of disbelief when I saw the email titled Deed Confirmation land in my inbox, complete with the surveyor's map stamped by the county clerk. That evening, I carried my laptop into the dining room, opened the aerial view of that scrubby stretch of land, and watched my father's eyes narrow. The screen showed wild grasses rippling under a pale sky, and the broker's note explained every foot was mine. He yanked the computer away so abruptly the coffee cup trembled on the table. "You think planting widgets in the dust counts as work?" he snapped, voice tight enough to crack glass. The polished silverware clicked against plates, as my siblings exchanged looks, proof of his fury caught in their startled faces. My sister's smirk cut the silence next. She shook her head, folding her arms like a judge passing sentence. "Solar domes out there," she sneered, glancing at the tiny blueprint I'd tucked into my folder, the one showing how collected sunlight would power a water pump. She tilted her head, as if daring me to explain how I'd haul a generator across a washboard gravel road. No one asked about my plans for gravity-fed irrigation, or the soil tests I'd commissioned by fax. They only marveled at how I'd gambled our family name on empty fields. Late that night, I crept to the porch and caught my father pacing under the street lamp's yellow glow. His silhouette leaned into his cell phone, tone fierce. "I heard him warn a friend in town. Let him chase windmills if he wants, but he won't find shelter under this roof when dawn breaks." I pressed my ear to the doorframe and heard footsteps stamp through the hallway as he ended the call. His betrayal echoed louder than any argument. Morning came with a locked door. I slid my key into the lock, familiar as breathing, but the bolt refused to turn. I rattled it, until the hinges groaned. Through the window, I saw my mother's scarf draped over the sofa where I once curled up after midnight study sessions. No one emerged to meet my plea. The hallway fell silent, except for the faint ticking of the clock I'd given them last Christmas. My phone chimed with a text from her, simple as a sigh. "Give him space." The words floated through me, empty of comfort. "They'd stopped calling it your home the moment that deed crossed your desk," she'd whispered. When I first shared the news, now even that had vanished. I retreated to my truck, boots scuffing the porch step, and drove until the city lights blurred behind me. Outside of town, wind-carved mesas stretched toward a copper sky. I parked on a dirt track and stepped out, inhaling the dry air, as if tasting freedom for the first time. I pulled the faded blueprint from my pocket, unfolding the hand-drawn lines that showed where solar panels would perch on a low ridge. My heart quieted, and I smiled, knowing the proof was in that paper, and the land itself, my proof of life beyond their narrow expectations. Old Joe's warning didn't sound like superstition. He squinted at the scrub brush and said the ground seemed to reject everything living, pointing out where his heifers had gone lame after grazing for just a day. I knelt at that spot and ran my fingers through dirt as dry as chalk, bits of corroded metal glinting like forgotten machine parts. When I held a handful to the light, the way it crumbled in my palm confirmed what his blank stare hinted. Something here had poisoned every living thing. My friend's drone survey felt like slipping through solid rock into another world. On his screen, I watched flat desert flicker into a grid of perfect angles, straight lines slicing through gullies that never bent with the land's curves. I traced a corridor that led beneath a rise of sand and sage, a shape too deliberate to be natural. The next morning I climbed that rise, pushing aside brittle branches until I found a rusted hatch buried just under the surface, its latch eaten away by time. Inside, the air hung heavy like a coffin. I clicked on my flashlight, and saw walls scarred by peeling paint and bars of exposed steel. A door stamped with a fading energy department seal stood ajar, hinge pins worn smooth by decades of disuse. I leaned in close, running my hand across the embossed lettering until I felt the cold bite of metal under my glove. Proof. This place answered to someone more powerful than any rancher. Crates filled one corner, their stenciled labels reading like a storyboard of old conflicts. Country names, weapons diagrams, ominous jargon. Maps pinned to the wall showed plotted missile zones far from home, every crease and tear preserved as if the watchers had stepped out only yesterday. I found a battered instrument tucked under a crate, wires coiled around a half-assembled battery cell marked thermal accumulator. When I flipped a switch, a faint glow pulsed in its core, enough to light a flicker of hope that this prototype had once held promise. My hands shook as I spotted a scratched name on a filing cabinet: Dr. Amos Lang. Back in town, I pulled a stack of yellowed news clippings from the library archives. his stern face peering from columns where he'd accused the government of contaminating land under the guise of progress. Another article recounted his disappearance after he stormed a hearing, charting chemical tests gone wrong. Reading his words in ink, I felt the weight of his warning echo. They buried the truth deep, but it still seeps out. That night, I spread clippings across my kitchen table, matching each headline to the relics I'd uncovered. A neighbor recalled his well water turning bitter whenever heavy equipment rumbled above ground. Old ranch hands whispered about strange lights over the ridge and unexplained sickness among livestock. Each voice, each ragged piece of paper, combined into a chorus that left no room for doubt. This soil had been poisoned by secret experiments, and the bunkers were the heart of that hidden history. I pressed my palm over a clipping headlined, "Scientist Vanishes," after exposing toxic tests, tracing the letters until they blurred with tears. I barely noticed. The dusty jacket by my door felt heavier now, a garment that once concealed a trail of lies. In that silence, I understood the land's real curse, one born not of spirits, but of human greed and broken promises, buried beneath the earth until someone dared to uncover it. I sat at the kitchen table, the photograph trembling in my fingers, my grandfather standing beside Dr. Lang, their protest signs raised as wind whipped their coats. That single image, sent by Aunt June in a brown envelope, confirmed what I'd long suspected. Grandpa hadn't just been a bystander, he marched for clean energy alongside Lang, even though family lore said he'd stayed quiet and respectable. Later, Aunt June reluctantly led me to her office, its mahogany desk cluttered with yellowing folders. She produced a heavy brass key and directed me to a locked compartment in her desk. Inside, I found letters bound with fraying ribbon, each addressed in Lang's flowing handwriting. One described his prototype turbine humming to life in a barn loft, the wooden blades creaking like old floorboards. Grandfather's reply, on stationery bearing his neat signature, outlined how he had rewired his garage light to run off Lang's turbine, marveling at electricity created by nothing but a breeze and ingenuity. That evening at home, I pried open my own filing cabinet and pulled out bank statements, simple check stubs labeled educational support and mortgage assistance. When I matched the amounts with my parents' remodel expenses, new counters in the kitchen, sleek fixtures installed under the guise of comfort, I realized those funds came from accounts in my name. A call to the family lawyer confirmed that my mother's college loans were paid off years ago, but only after she signed over her share of the ranch to my father. He'd never mentioned the trade, and she had never told me. I unfolded a crisp agreement framed on my parents' hallway wall, my mother's signature at the bottom of a dense page that forbid any talk of past affiliations. As I traced the embossed notary seal, I felt each clause stiffen the air around our family's history, silencing the truth of my grandfather's work. Next, I slipped into the county clerk's office, where the old protest permits were kept. The clerk, recognizing my grandfather's name, pulled a brittle file, permits issued for rallies, demanding public trials of Lang's energy devices. Permits that listed my grandfather as co-organizer. A stack of newspaper clippings followed, complete with photographs of him handing out leaflets under a hand-painted banner. Those reports had never been mentioned at home. They proved he'd risked his reputation for a cause he believed in. Back in my workshop, I placed the three artifacts, the photograph, the letters, the signed agreement, side by side on my workbench, their details intertwined. The photo showed Grandpa's determined gaze. The letters revealed his questions about turbine designs. The contract laid bare the pact that buried his legacy. I remembered finding Grandpa in his den, hunched over mechanical sketches late at night, and now I understood why he'd hidden that part of himself. As rain pattered against the window, I let the proof settle around me. Each scenario, the protest march, the secret letters, the hidden payments, the clandestine agreement, had left its mark, undeniable evidence of a history kept in shadows. Holding those pieces of paper, I felt connected to a truth my family denied. I would carry their story forward, honoring the courage Grandpa showed alongside Dr. Lang, and finally give that buried legacy the light it deserved. The first hint of interference came when I returned to the county office to check on my permit, and the clerk looked up with polite confusion. "It's not here," she said, sliding an empty folder across the desk. When I pressed for details, she murmured that her supervisor had told her the file was misplaced again, and she invited me to reapply. whenever the moment suited. A week later, I received a letter from the Public Records Office showing an internal memo from a zoning staffer to the Planning Commissioner's inbox, flagged by an email address matching my father's law firm. The subject line read something like, "Hold everything on Keller's application," and a brief note explained it was at legal counsel's request. Seeing his firm's logo on a government document made my heart sink. I had already set up my weather station and secured the first shipment of metal blades when I discovered my industrial-grade cordless drill was gone from the lock shed. I watched back the grainy overnight footage on my own security camera, a dark sedan pulling up under the dim yard light, a figure stepping out, unscrewing the shed lock, and slipping back into the car. When I handed that video over to the sheriff, he frowned at the timestamp and said, "Looks cloudy," and declined to pursue it further. I realized then that someone had whispered into his ear to treat it as nuisance noise, not evidence. Next came the bank, where I'd hoped to secure a modest loan to install foundation pilings. I sat across from the loan officer in a small interview room, my proposal printed on crisp paper. She returned it without comment, then slid a form across the table reading "Application cannot proceed." I asked why, and she pointed out a brief email attached to her computer screen from the bank's investment committee member, a man whose name I recognized from a charity gala my father hosted. In that email, he argued my project was unlikely to repay, urging his colleagues to protect the bank's interests. The loan officer looked away and offered a sympathetic smile, as if apologizing for someone else's choice. Finally, the lights blinked off in my workshop one evening just as the linemen arrived to disconnect power. Their note, unsigned but stamped with the utility manager's office, explained service had been suspended by order of the planning commissioner, citing an indeterminate zoning issue. When I called to protest, the dispatcher told me the request came directly from the commissioner's private line. I stood under the empty glow of street lamps, wrench in hand, understanding that the same man who'd promised community support was now weaponizing the grid to keep me silent. Each obstacle, the vanishing permit, the stolen drill, the rejected loan, the frozen utilities, arrived at the moment I dared to take another step. Yet every document pointed back to a whisper from my father's sphere of influence, proving this wasn't coincidence. Gathering the memos, the video stills, the bank notes, and the utility order, I drafted a detailed complaint for the state inspector. As I pressed send, I felt a quiet shift. The barriers he built to hold me back were now laid bare, and suddenly I could see a path forward through the storm of sabotage. I still remember the moment Ben, broom in hand, wandered into my garage and froze at the sight of those battered bunker panels stacked against the workbench. He'd spent years polishing school hallways, but his eyes lit up at the sight of Department of Energy plates welded to corroded steel. He ran his fingers along the rusted tags, proof that these components had once sat beneath the desert's surface, and grinned as I slid open a dusty crate to reveal the prototype's fractured control board. "This was military grade," he whispered, voice low with awe. "That relic, dug from cold earth, became our foundation." That night I rigged up a makeshift climate chamber beneath a flickering strip light. I watched the laptop's waveform climb, as I funneled warm water through coils under the concrete floor, then switched to the small wind array I'd suspended from ceiling beams. As the chart plateaued beyond anything I'd dared hope, Ben leaned over my shoulder, heart pounding. He tapped the screen where it tracked uninterrupted power, a line stretching far past the lab's clock. "It's holding," he muttered, checking the temperature gauge that never wavered. In that steady glow, our long hours felt justified. I edited the footage into a tight sequence, bunker panels sliding into view, the chambers humming to life, lights flickering on then remaining steadfast, and uploaded it before dawn. By lunchtime, comments flooded in, a farmer from the Midwest marveling that his barn lights stayed on through a storm, an engineer praising the battery's unheard of steadiness, a voice questioning whether this tech could aid remote clinics. When a message pinged from a Seattle investor asking if I was open to licensing, I paused. I scrolled back through every grainy shot and quiet handshake in my workshop before typing a cautious, "Let's discuss." In Denver, the conference hall fell silent as I flipped a switch, and the array of lights along the stage erupted in warmth. Cameras swiveled, and attendees edged forward, jaws dropping at each meter I powered. When I swept aside the demonstration rig and opened the floor for questions, 4 delegates pressed forward, each with polished folders and earnest expressions. One slid a leather-bound contract across the podium, Another extended a business card emblazoned with venture capital logos. A third spoke of global deployment strategies over clasped hands, while a fourth offered a buyout figure written on thick stationery. I lifted my gaze to the projector, where the phrase "innovation erased can be reclaimed" glowed behind me. Drawing a deep breath, I met every expectant face. If one family could bury half a century of progress, I'll dedicate decades to ensuring no discovery vanishes. I said, voice steady. A hush settled, broken only by a single nod from an engineer in the back. Without a word, I slipped past the waiting contracts, leaving my contact email displayed for anyone who believed that true invention could never stay hidden. When the lights dim and the film starts, I recognize the crumbling bunker walls from my late-night excavation, the projector's glow dancing over layers of peeling paint. The narrator's calm voice introduces a faded memo, stamped with my father's firm letterhead, where he approved funds for a coalition meeting to address emerging threats. My pulse spikes when a former executive, voice rough with age, recounts how he watched my father hand out coffee in that very boardroom, joking that those wind people don't know what's coming. The camera cuts to a shadowy photo of him leaning forward, suit jacket draped over the chair, hand resting on columns of financial forecasts, predicting the collapse of every small solar startup. A hush falls when the screen shifts to an email excerpt, words blinking on a plain white background, "Hold all permits until further notice." The filmmaker explains how that single directive stalled a prototype battery test in its infancy. The blueprints left to gather dust. Then comes a grainy security recording from a remote research lab, where a technician's frantic voice echoes as equipment is seized by unmarked agents. He says, "They arrived without warning. No badge, just that order." And I recognize the corridor, the same one where I first glimpsed the armored crates hidden beneath floorboards. The documentary foregrounds my own footage, rough and handheld, showing my uncovering of Dr. Lang's notebooks among fallen timbers. My hand trembles as I brush away debris, revealing his precise schematics for a thermal cell that could have powered entire villages. Then it cuts back to my father in a crisply lit interview, insisting it's an imaginative retelling. But a follow-up shot reveals the moment his lawyer's email lands in the coal lobby's archives. Operation Eclipse, neutralize threat by any means. His denial fractures under the weight of that proof. An energy NGO scientist appears next, describing how her pilot station lay silent for months due to unexplained permit lapses. She holds a faded permit application stamped received yet never approved. "We never saw that document again," she says, voice tight with frustration. The screen fills with transcripts of planning commission minutes, tears and scribbles marking crossed-out approvals, handwriting that matches my father's scrawled initials from a school notebook he once showed me. As the film crescendos, the narrator quotes a whistleblower engineer who leaked audio of a heated conference call, "If these kids ever light up a single bulb, we'll pull the plug." The room shifts. I feel the air thicken as the audience catches the gravity. Finally, the title card reads "The Son Who Uncovered a Buried Future," and I watch my own face, older than I feel, reflecting hope and heartbreak in equal measure. When the screen goes black, the silence is deafening. I check my phone to find messages pouring in, concerned colleagues, old neighbors, the retired archivist who supplied that missing ledger. A headline scrolls across a news alert: "Oil magnate's dark legacy exposed by his own son." I close my eyes, letting the truth settle, knowing every hidden document, every hushed confession, has finally taken its rightful place in the light. When the turbine in the orchard roars awake before sunrise, its blades slicing through the dawn air, I know we've crossed a threshold. I'm there at first light, watching the meter beside the control box tick upward with a steady glow. By mid-morning, the local grid operator calls me on my cell, voice tight with surprise, to confirm that our hybrid storage unit ran for hours without a hitch, during a gusty front more reliable than the diesel backup they've relied on. That afternoon, neighbors begin dropping by the site trailer, offering sandwiches and cold drinks, asking how soon they can join our pilot program. Their eager questions, and genuine gratitude, remind me that this technology isn't a theory anymore. It's real power in action. Back in the city, whispers ripple through my father's offices. I learn from a former executive, one who slipped me a message when he saw my name in the headlines, that the board convened an emergency session in their glass-walled conference room. When someone announces the vote result, I picture their stunned faces in a grainy photo I once glimpsed, rustling papers, furrowed brows, and unspoken reckoning as they strip him of the title he's held for decades. That same evening, I find an apology letter from the investment bank that once turned me away, sitting in my inbox. Its subject line reads, "A lesson learned," and inside, the regional director confesses their error, praising our approach to community energy and promising to back future deployments. I forward it to my engineer and my logistics coordinator, watching each of them smile at the screen. Later, a clean energy trade newsletter lands in my inbox with a headline about regulators opening a probe into my father's influence over zoning decisions. I pull the published minutes from the Planning Commission's website and see red-stamped annotations marking certain files withheld. An anonymous tip from a county planner confirms that internal emails instructed staff to stall any permit bearing my name. Holding the printed pages in my hand, I know the injustice is documented. That night, as I unlock my apartment door, a crisp envelope slides onto the welcome mat. Inside is my father's handwriting, elegant, familiar, lamenting his pride and confessing surprise at my resolve. He begs me to reconsider before the family name is torn apart. I hold the letter at eye level, his words echoing in my chest. I don't send a reply. Instead, I slip the letter into a frame on my workshop shelf, right beside the prototype drawing I sketched by candlelight last year. I glance at the photo of the farmer who sold me that rusted turbine housing, smiling under a wide-brimmed hat when I told him the parts would speak again. By dawn, I'm back at the orchard, boots on dew-damp grass, ready to fine-tune the next unit. Reports of subpoenas and resignations buzz through my phone, but here, amid humming generators and curious onlookers, the future hums a different tune. They tried to bury innovation. We unearthed it, and now it powers us all. When the NASA engineer crouched beside our gleaming battery modules and ran his fingers over the insulated canisters, I couldn't help but think back to the dusty bunker where we found those very parts hidden behind rusted doors. He tapped a sensor display and murmured to his team about the consistency of our prototype's performance in simulated lunar thermal cycles, proof that the thermal cell we recovered from the Cold War wardroom could store energy for days without failing. Watching him nod at the readouts convinced me it wasn't just my imagination, that those salvaged components mattered. It was real. A caravan of school buses rolled in under a pale afternoon sky, and a gaggle of teenagers flooded the courtyard, notebooks in hand and cameras poised. Their science teacher led them past the repurposed wind tower, standing sentinel over our test field, explaining how I'd replaced each corroded metal blade with a lightweight composite version I modeled on my bedroom desk. One student crouched by the tower's base, brushing leaves from the control panel we'd installed, and marveled when I showed her the original manufacturer's stamp still faint on welded seams. Her class buzzed with excitement as she recorded the detail, knowing this dusty farm no longer lived in obscurity. As golden light filtered through the lab's glass facade, community leaders and long-skeptical neighbors gathered for the ceremony that once would have been unthinkable. The ribbon snapping open revealed a polished sign etched with two names: the scientist whose hidden notes launched this revival, and the grandfather who once sketched those same equations on yellowing paper in a quiet study. I watched one of my cousins lean close to read the inscription, her eyes widening when she recognized the handwriting matched letters in a weathered journal we discovered tucked behind old portraits. That moment, her disbelief turning to admiration, made every lonely hour of backbreaking work worth it. Later, I slipped away to the field's edge, where we'd placed a simple stone plinth crowned by a weathered metal plate. Pulling away the draped cloth, I revealed the words we'd chosen to honor both the lands and my own journey from neglect to purpose. A retired farmer, whose family had once warned me to leave the property to fools and dreamers, approached quietly, resting a hand on my shoulder. He said he'd driven out at dawn to watch my first prototype spin in a gale, and had been amazed that such promise lay buried where everyone else saw only rocks and scrub. As dusk settled, turbines whispered in the breeze and rows of solar panels reflected the last glow of sunlight. I traced the energy conduits leading back to the lab, remembering when I'd first mapped out their route on scrap paper beneath a streetlight. Tonight, they pulsed with possibility. Standing beneath the stars, surrounded by proof of every risk and rescue and discovery, I realized the land had never been worthless, and I had never been forgotten.